Hey, everybody. This is a monumental moment because I am recording the very first episode in our new home, which is so exciting. The walls are pretty empty and pretty bare, but hey, we will get there day by day. This place is starting to feel more and more like a home. So I am really excited for it. And I'm also very excited for today's interview. We have with us very special guest, Kimberley Pittman-Schulz. And Kimberley is an award-winning poet and author who writes, teaches, and speaks about death, living mindfully, and being a force for change in the world. With 25 plus years as a philanthropy leader and charitable and end-of-life planning advisor, Kimberley has worked with incredibly diverse people looking for meaning after the loss of a spouse, a partner, a child, a sibling, a parent, a grandparent, or a beloved animal. Her focus is helping people cultivate joy every day so they can more deeply experience the meaning and beauty of their one and only lives. So with that being said, hi, Kim. Thank you so much for being here and welcome to the podcast.
Alyssa, thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation to talk with you and to talk with your listeners. I really admire your podcast and I look forward to this conversation with you.
Thank you. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while, and I really think that timing is just so interesting to me sometimes. And I almost feel like nothing is a coincidence. You know, speaking of grief, it's one of those things. And I tend to be very open, like the listeners know, I tend to be very open about my recovery journey on the podcast. And one of the things that I think in light, so I just recently moved. So this is the first podcast episode that I am recording in the new home, which is very exciting. And one of the things that I think has come up for me, especially this week. So today is Thursday that we are recording this for the listeners. And I have been in the grief, a pit of grief since probably like Monday it hit me. I'm starting to come out of it. But to me, grief is one of the things, like from my perspective, that we tend to spend so much of our lives avoiding and running from and finding ways to numb out, because I think it's one of the most difficult things. So how do you, what has inspired you to say, I'm going to take one of the most painful feelings on earth and I'm going to dive right in and I'm going to write about it and share about it? What inspired you to do that?
Self-punishment, maybe? To be absolutely
self-loathing.
I think, grief, loss, none of us get out of it alive. Some of us get to live, some of us don't. And those of us that are left behind need to deal with it. And grief is so many things. It's not even one thing. You've got anger and guilt and regret and longing, and there's so many emotions bundled up in that. And then there's so many different grieving styles. So for me, part of it was learning to navigate my own grief. Years ago, I very much was stuck in a grief hole for 2 years after my mother died, and a friend committed suicide 2 weeks before she died. So I had these things bundled together. And as a child, I survived a house fire that my 2 sisters sleeping in the same room did not. And so for me, this loss and navigating it, my mother could never talk about it. So when you're a little kid and you can't really talk about what happened, what happened to my sisters, what happened to the house, you have to do a lot of figuring out on your own. And so when we got into the pandemic, I started just really hearing some people's pain, what they're struggling with, and feeling like there's a million systems for getting better, but people were struggling. So I thought maybe what has worked for me, and I've worked with a lot of people over the years through my philanthropy and end-of-life planning work, practices that have helped them. So I really want to, and I love to write. I'm also a writer before I'm anything else. So for me, it was about trying to help other people navigate grief. And whenever you are trying to teach others, let's face it, you're also teaching yourself.
Absolutely. Right. We were just saying that before we started recording, right? Doing all of this, we're helping others as much as we're helping ourselves. And right. So you are a writer, as I said in the introduction, and you have, I think it's important to talk about, you have a book out that was just released in March of this year, and it was a #1 release on Amazon in several different categories. And the name of that book is Grieving Us. Now, is that your first book that you've written on grief?
Yes, it's the first book I've written on grief, and the first book I've written other than poetry. My first book was 10 years ago. It was a poetry volume, and interestingly enough, the name of that volume is Moss Light. It was published by a literary publisher and won a National Book Award, actually, at that time. And when you go back and look at the poems, there is a lot of grief, resilience, navigating loss. And so, actually going back and looking at that book and hearing from people who've read that book reminded me that this is just sort of who I am, and as we move further through life, I think it has a great focusing effect in helping you figure out what am I supposed to do? How can I make the most meaning while I'm here on the planet for myself and others?
Yeah. Yeah. Now, can you give us a brief synopsis of your book? I love the title, like Grieving Us. Like, what does that mean?
Right. And the subtitle is important too, because it's based on a question that people ask me all the time. The subtitle is, how to live with loss without losing yourself. Because the #1 question I often hear is, how do I live with this without losing myself? I feel so lost. Because when someone that's been a critical part of your life leaves you, now that could, we're talking about death here, but it can be divorce. It can be all kinds of reasons why somebody's not in your life anymore. You do actually lose part of your life. There's a dailiness to the way we love people. I say in the book, love is a habit, and how you love people takes shape in rituals and habits and routines. And so when that person is not in your life, your days can literally be broken. And it can be hard sometimes for people to pinpoint why they're having a hard time as they're moving through grief, starting to find well-being or inviting joy back in. So the synopsis, Grieving Us, is really intended to function on a few different levels, because I always say when one person dies, there's always at least 3 deaths. There's the person that you love who's lost. You cannot help, it is human nature to look at yourself and say, wow, I could be next. Am I next? Or in some cases, people say, do I want to keep on living? So we reflect on our own mortality. And then the relationship you had with that person is like a third party, if you will, because that is also gone. And you have to hold on to that person in a different way. And then for me, there's another sort of level of meaning in that my husband is in his end of life time. And so I'm living with my own anticipatory grief and trying to live with joy and grieving at the same time. So it has a large context as well as a very personal context for me, Alyssa.
Yes. And I really appreciate what you said about the joy and the grief, and that, I think so many of us fall into a place of suffering, partially because we feel that they're like polar opposites and can't coexist. But I think it's very important to know that both can be there.
For me, it's a basic premise. It can sound hokey or corny or naive to say, oh, yeah, right, grief and joy coexist. But I've discovered that that's just true. The question is, how do you get there? Because so often, Alyssa, and I'm sure you hear it in the clients that you work with, I've got to get through grief to joy, as if joy is a destination. And I was having this conversation with someone recently, and it would just kind of bubble out of my mouth. And I thought, wow, that's kind of true. Is that grief, the joy is not a destination. It's really a dimension. And so part of what I teach in my book, I start by having people tell their lost story to themselves, because often we tell our lost stories to everybody but ourselves. But then the next step, and what was really the healing aha moment for me, is what I've come to call tiny come back to your senses rituals. It's creating, and I started with just literally a few minutes, like 3 minutes, where I created an opening in the grief. And for that moment, I was just so fully in the moment. I mean, I could tell you a little bit more about the process, but the idea was that I had created a break in my grief through this ritual that allowed a little bit of joy. And when I say joy, I want to maybe define that a little bit too, because there's happy, right? Riding a roller coaster makes you happy, but we say makes you happy because we know that's transient, right? And a little bit later, we're looking for something else to make us happy. For me, joy is related, but it is a different thing. It's about knowing you're meant to be here. It's about being in this moment right now. I'm having this wonderful conversation with you and getting a chance to meet with you and talk with you about this, and to be fully immersed in this moment and have it have a sense of meaning and purpose, and just knowing that no matter what else is going on in my life or the rest of the day, everything's okay right in this moment. And to me, that's a big part of what joy is. And it is there ever present. It's just creating that break in the grief to be able to let the light of it come in and root and grow. And then the goal is, as we move through grief, to just make those breaks bigger and let a little bit more joy in.
And when you say the break in the grief, you get that break in the grief through what you call the tiny come back to your senses rituals. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. I stumbled into it, Alyssa, really by accident. I mean, I was in this, what turned out to be a little over 2-year period of being what I call lost limbo after my mother died and Ruth had committed suicide. And these were just so linked together. They're still linked together in my life and in my grief and in my sense of loss. And we had moved across country from where I had lost my mother, and happened to live on a stretch that had some river frontage. And I remember one of the things that happens when you're grieving, right? I'm sure you've experienced this through all of your own healing from trauma, is how broken some of your habits and rituals get. But there's always a few things that you still do. For instance, I will always make a cup of tea in the morning, no matter what. I mean, the world could be burning. I'm going to have my cup of tea, right?
You're having that tea.
Well,
yep.
Yeah, exactly. Well, at that point in my life, I also, before I went to bed, no matter what, I always locked the doors. And one night before I locked the doors, I decided to just wander out to the river. And so I walked out to the river, and I stood at the edge of the river, and I just listened to the water. And I don't know if you've had this experience, Alyssa, but some of your listeners, sometimes the movement of water over rocks can almost even sound like voices. And you think, is there someone upstream? And it really isn't. It's just literally the voice of the water and the volume of it going through and over the rocks. And then, you hear a bird shuffling. It's, quietly in a tree. And, there's a little bit of fog coming in. And so I was really feeling the sensation of the fog on my arms. And as I turned to walk back in the house, it suddenly just dawned on me, in that little space, just a few minutes, I didn't feel awful.
Yeah.
I didn't feel awful. I felt okay. And so as I came back in and I locked the door, I realized I was on to something. And I began to then intentionally build some of these brief rituals into habits that were already working, because I think that's the hard type thing, is people will say, go do X or go do Y. I was like, how do I do it? But if you find that 1 or 2 things in your day that actually works, you can add on, start with just 3 minutes. And even the busiest or most burdened people can find usually that 3 minutes.
Yes, I so appreciate that. And coming off the heels of feeling such intense grief the last several days, I know that for me, right, it's one of those things you can't snap out of it. There's no like, I'm going to snap out of this. And no, it's, for me, the transformation happened in the 30 seconds that it took me to go online and book an appointment for myself. And I noticed that while I was doing that, I was okay. I had my diffuser on. The air smelled really nice. I had a blanket on. My dog was like curled up next to me. And I was like, it took me 30 seconds. But after those 30 seconds, I went, oh, I didn't feel like my world was crashing down around me for 30 seconds. And like, to me, that's the process more than like, oh, well, today I had a great day. I did this, I did that. And I'm so happy. And thank God I'm not in that bad place anymore. It's like, it doesn't really work like that.
No. And you can have a day that's really crappy, but instead of having a day that's crappy all day, to have a few moments like that where you really are getting a break and you really are feeling like, okay, I'm not going to take on the universe here. And I'm not the best I've ever been. Wow, I got a break for a little bit. And that, to my mind, is where it all starts.
Yeah. And I also love what you said about like your journey to the river, because I relate to that so much. I think that I first started tapping into this enormous wave of grief back in early June when we went to the Finger Lakes and we were on vacation. It was my first time I went to the Finger Lakes, and just sitting on the water and hearing the water splash up against the rocks and looking at the fish swimming in the water. I was like, I find that my grief can be healed, or at least not healed, but understood. And I can get some relief from it in nature, particularly in the water, like near water.
Yeah, I would share that. And I'm kind of a nature geek anyway, so it certainly works for me. I've had people say to me, though, Kimberly, I'm just not a nature type, so this isn't going to work for me. And I would say, no, and I've worked with a number of people to implement something that works for them. One woman I used to work with, a colleague, had, I think it was her brother that she had lost. And so she was talking about every night she would get through the day. She's what I call a hummingbird griever. She was able to keep going through it. Some of us kind of want to be like bears and go in a cave and just leave me alone until I feel better. Others are what I call hummingbirds, and they just keep doing, trying to kind of keep ahead of the grief, right?
Yep.
But she would get home at the end of the day and she said, I'm just crying into my Chardonnay every night. And she said, I'm drinking too much of it too, to be absolutely honest. And so, I don't know where I would put. So I said, you know what? Why don't you start your tiny come back to your senses ritual around that glass of wine? And she says, okay, well, I get the taste and I do, I can try to remember to smell it, and she says, but how do you hear wine? I said, tap on the edge of the glass.
Oh, yeah.
Or listen to the sound of it going down your throat. I mean, just be very, very mindful. So try to use all 5 senses when you drink that glass of wine. And it was several months later I ran into him and she goes, I thought what you said was kind of crazy, but you know what? It slowed me down. I actually enjoyed my glass of wine more. And she said, I'm not drinking as much of it. And so, for her, she had what she called her wine time. That was her tiny come back to her senses rituals, was just really experiencing the entire glass of wine with all of her senses. So sometimes it takes a little creativity to figure out what works. And that's what I love about, what I've tried to teach is that this isn't take what works for me and now you have to make it work, because you're a different person. But
Exactly.
You can take the concept and adapt it to what's meaningful for you.
Exactly. And I love that. Now, I want to shift gears a little bit because I really want to dive into this. So can we talk about animals for a moment? Because, and oh dear Lord, if I get through this conversation without shedding one tear, that will be a huge victory, because animals, I love. I have 3 dogs. All animals. I am a huge animal lover. And I really think that this is important to talk about, because I can't tell you how many people come into my office and have lost pets and are absolutely devastated beyond belief, but feel as though they shouldn't. And this is not an uncommon thing. So many people feel that losing pets can be harder in some ways than losing people. So many people, myself included, I will watch TV and I will watch true crime documentaries all day long. But let me tell you, if there is one episode where an animal is harmed or killed, I'm done. Like, done. And I know I'm not alone in that. So is that something that you can talk more about? Like, is there a reason why it feels so much harder?
Oh my gosh. Alyssa, I am so simpatico, but no, I mean, I feel exactly every word that you just said. So many people I've known and worked with, I feel the same way. Early in my life, I worked with the UC Davis School of Veterinary Medicine. It was the first veterinary school to actually create a pet loss support hotline, because helping veterinarians learn how to deal with the grief that their patients had over a pet was such a big issue. Veterinarians didn't know how to handle it. About a year ago, I gave a talk on death to estate and financial planners who are focused on helping people plan for the end of life, but never want to talk about death. Pets are huge for people, and it certainly depends. In my book, I tell a story about after my dog died. Technically, he was my stepdog because he came with my husband like a dowry, right? And the person, it was a mutt, Heinz 57, but he was really cute, really sweet. We had, we walked together, did a lot together. And after he died, someone in the community, kind of ran into me and said, "Oh, well, at least it's a dog. You can get another." And I am not a violent person, Alyssa, but I really, what the vision went through my head of really smacking her one, it's just because it wasn't just a dog or just, I mean, you wouldn't say that if somebody lost a child or a spouse. Right. And and for me, part of what I think can be in some ways, and this is why I do think some people, I have a friend who lost her father and a dog within a few weeks of each other. And she says, "Of course, I miss my father. He was 94. I spent the last few months caring for him." But she goes, "I have to admit, the dog is actually way harder. It was a rescue dog and it had been doing great. And then something just suddenly came up and it was gone." And I think, one of the things you don't hear people talk a lot about is the dailiness of people and animals in our lives. So animals are often, spouses may come and go to work, partners may come and go, kids come and go, but often, those dogs or cats, like right now I'm a cat lady, we have kittens, well, technically cats, but they're still kittens to me.
Always kittens.
Always kittens.
Always be kittens.
Yeah. So you have this dailiness, of, like this morning, just brushing my hair, the cat's on the, the counter in the bathroom watching me brush my hair. And we have little things that we do, little habits together. And so throughout the day, they're an intimate part of my daily life. So when you lose a companion animal, again, you have all those little gaps that you have to learn to bridge because that being isn't there. And let's face it, animals love us no matter what we look like or act like. I mean, unless we're abusive people, it's truly the most unconditional love you're going to find.
It is. And even, sometimes even if people are abusive, an animal will still look at you and beg for love and attention and affection. It is the most unconditional love that I've ever, I think I've ever experienced. I'm thinking of this morning as we're having this conversation. So we moved into this new house, and we used to, in our old house, because we had carpet upstairs, we kept the dogs, downstairs, didn't let them upstairs. They weren't in the bedroom. We don't have carpet in this house. So the dogs are upstairs, downstairs, they're everywhere, right? Everywhere I go, I'm tripping over a dog. This morning, opened my eyes popped open suddenly. And I see, I have two Australian Shepherds. One of my Australian Shepherds, he is 2 years old. His head was resting on the bed and he was making direct eye contact with me and grinning from ear to ear. I could see all his teeth. And he was so happy. Like, he was just staring at me, waiting for me to get up. And as soon as I opened my eyes, he was like, "Mom, hi, let's get up. I love you. You look beautiful. No, your breath doesn't stink," as I'm like breathing my morning breath on him. And I'm just like, those are the moments that are unparalleled.
Well, there's nothing quite like dog love like that. I mean, there isn't. And someday, when that beautiful little being is not a physical presence, you're going to continue to have that wonderful emotional presence. You just don't forget it. And, that, never. Again, that dailiness, other people in your life, except maybe a spouse, partner, kids, who else fills that kind of a role? It's just a very, and if you are, as I am, an animal person, and what's tough is when animal people then are experiencing losses around people who aren't and don't get it. And, what I usually say to people is resist the temptation to let that be a burden to you and be frustrated or angry, because that's just more emotion on top of grief. And it's better just to, let it go and just, know that's their loss, right? And just focus on caring for yourself. But the problem is a lot of times people are made to feel like they're grieving wrong. And that's true with humans too. But particularly with animals, people can be made to feel like they're wrong or weird. And I'm just here to say, no, you're not. You, again, if you didn't love, gosh darn it, it wouldn't be a problem. But you love. So when you lose that physical presence of someone you love, whether that someone has 4 legs, fur, and a tail, it's going to hurt.
Excruciating grief. Yeah, I think that's a huge problem, is that it's not, people are in their grief, but then they're also made to feel somewhat guilty or like a little bit like weird for the grief that they have. I remember when I got my dog, I have a little dog, and I got her. She was born 6 days after I escaped from an abusive relationship. I got out of his house on July 14th, and she was born 6 days later. And 2 months after that, I had her. I had no idea I was getting a dog. Like, she found me. I swear to this day, the gods created her because they were like, all right, she's going to need some love. Have her. So 2 days ago, she turned 8. And so I remember when I first got her, when I tell you I'm enamored with this dog and people would say things to me like, don't you love her a little too much? Or like would say things like,
how is that even possible?
Right? How is that even possible? Or my favorite was like, I know you love your dog, but like, you do know your dog's going to die eventually, right? Like, you got to like separate a little bit. And
it's like, well, I know you're going to die too, but hey,
well, I still like you. Yeah.
Right.
A little less now that you said that, but but yeah, like these are the kinds of things that we say, like for people who are avid pet lovers or people who have lost a pet. It's like, oh, you just get another one. And it's like, so now on top of our grief, we feel guilt for the love that
guilt and or like we're stupid or weird or abnormal, and that's just no good at all. I mean, it's just no good at all. And there's so many other ways too through grief that people feel that way. But I'll take anybody who loves and grieves any day over someone who surprisingly doesn't love that much, and so they don't have to navigate that grief journey as much.
Yes. I don't remember who said this, but I remember I heard this quote in, this is one of my favorite books, is David Kessler, The 6 Stages of Grief, Finding Meaning. And a phenomenal book for the listeners out there. I know I've recommended it multiple times on this podcast, but he talked a lot about how grief, yes, there is a way to avoid grief, but the way to avoid grief is to avoid love. You can't avoid one without the other, without avoiding the other.
It's like two sides of the same coin, really. I mean, absolutely. And the whole issue of meaning too is really important, because I feel like, when you talk about human beings, what makes human beings different than a lot of other animals? As a kid, I grew up and the answer was always opposable thumbs, right? Because we can grasp things with our opposable thumbs. But I really think it's actually meaning making is our superpower as human beings, because it allows us to grasp things with our minds. And that means you can really assign meaning where you want it. You get to choose what's meaningful to you. And so that can be who you love. It can be how you grieve. In my book, I tell a story about, that I can teach my cat to know the word dragonfly. And like I have a pond in my yard, and so I can say dragonfly, and the cat knows I'm referring to that thing that she'd love to catch going back and forth above the pond. But what I can't teach her to do is what I do when I see a dragonfly. It is tied to my mother. So when I see a dragonfly, I'm also thinking of my mother. Mm-hmm. And I asked myself, could I ever teach my cat a word that when she saw the thing, she could equate it not only to the thing in the physical world, but to a memory of her own mother as a kitten? And I was like, I don't think I can. And so that is, I think, and I know David also talks about things like this in his book. This whole idea of meaning is ultimately, I think, how we move through grief and get to better place of well-being, and even defining what joy means and how we make more of that in our lives comes through our ability that we get to say what's meaningful.
Yeah. Yes. And finding meaning is so helpful. And does that for you, from your perspective, fall into the same category as like helping others, like finding meaning also with helping others? Because I know you talked about like how much helping others can be hugely impactful in the grieving process.
To me, they're tied at the hip. And I mean, certainly for me personally, sometimes when I think about, I spent a lot of my career working in philanthropy with people. We don't often think about this, even people who work in philanthropy often, unless you stop and really think about it, so much of philanthropy, so much of giving back, whether that's a financial contribution or volunteering or random acts of kindness. When you drill down to what motivates a person to do those things, what you often realize.
I just saw a cat.
I couldn't make her stay out. So it's just, I thought rather than having her paw at the door, it'd be easier just to, let her be. I woke her up talking about animals or something. But I just feel like as we move through our grief and our healing process and we think about what's meaningful. So, and so for me, what I realize is a lot of that motivation to give back and help others in any sort of way often does come from a place of loss and of trying to, one of the things you can't, like when I talk about meaning, people will say, do you mean I'm supposed to believe that someone's death, there's meaning to that, or it was done for a reason? I said, well, you have to decide if that's what you believe. I personally don't think somebody died because it was the thing that was supposed to happen. I just, that's my personal belief system. For some people, they really do believe the death is part of a plan. And I think, again, each person has to find their way there. But what I do believe is that we do, when we start to think about giving of ourselves, it not only makes us feel good to be helping others, it not only creates a little bit of a break and a distraction in pain, but it does make a difference in other people's lives. And so much of the giving impulse does come from a place of pain. And I've sat with many individuals, volunteers, donors, people involved at doing frontline charitable work, hospice volunteers and nurses, how much of that motivation comes from a place of pain and trying to make some meaning for them by helping others.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Even therapists, right?
Yep. And podcast hosts,
writers, right? People aren't writing about this stuff because, it's coming from a place of joy and never having lived or experienced. And people are writing from their own pain or working or whatever it is they do, volunteering coming from a place of their own pain.
Definitely. No, definitely. And I think even small, we tend to think of random acts of kindness as being, goody two shoes or Pollyanna or something like that, or maybe even sounding hokey. But to be absolutely honest, that's a strategy I often suggest. I was literally writing a post that I'll be posting later about this very topic, that when I talk with people who are struggling with grief, a lot of times they've lost that sense of meaning and purpose in their lives without their beloved other, whoever that, or whatever creature that may be, or person or animal, whatever. And, I really want people to realize that they have a heartbroken but still beautiful life. I hate for people to sort of give away their life. It takes time. I'm not saying, just get over it. That's not what I'm saying at all. But to take the time to realize you are going to have to build a new life, which means creating a new version of you that didn't exist before. I mean, you didn't ask for this giant change in your life. It has happened to you, right? So you've got to create something new out of that. So finding a way to give back in small ways and realizing how often you have done or other people have done to you generous things, whether it's paying for someone's coffee in line behind you, or just a nice word or a nice compliment that you may think is completely offhand that can make a huge difference from somebody. And you never know. There are times years later, I'll run into somebody and they'll say, back in so-and-so, you said this to me. I can't tell you what a difference it makes. And I'm sitting there thinking, I said that? And I was like, yeah, it sounds like something I would say, but I don't even remember what they're talking about. So it's so important to realize that as long as you're physically in this world and you can't help but take up space, you are going to impact others. And one of the choices you can make is to be a little more intentional about that. And when you're first kind of putting those very first feelers out from that place of grief, trying to find some ground, starting with something as simple as a compliment to somebody, or some, truly what seems like random is really not random at all. Act of kindness to somebody else is going to actually make you feel pretty good. And again, it's like your 30 seconds this morning, in that space, everything was okay.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In that space, everything was okay. When I woke up this morning and opened my eyes and saw a big hairy dog smiling at me. I was like, everything's fine. Everything's fine. I love it. I thank you so, so much for sharing. Now, of course, if people would like to find your book, have questions or want to purchase your book, where's the easiest way? Is it via Amazon?
Well, of course, Amazon sells about 72% of the planet's books. So yes, you'll find all versions of my books there. I also encourage people to work with their local bookseller who can order just about anything on the planet as well. And you're buying local as well. Yes. I also have a website as well, website link. And in fact, I set up a landing page for your listeners. So my website is poetal.com. So there's just a /light after trauma. And so they can go and they'll see your podcast cover and not feel like they're going to a stranger's house. So they can click on a link and get the book there, or, explore some other information that's there as well. I'm in the process of putting together a workshop. So there are some other resources there that I'm building out.
Fantastic. So poetal.com/light after trauma. Oh, yes. All right. So the listeners, I'm there now. This is such a lovely page. So what I will do, so for the listeners out there, I will be linking that in the show notes so you know where to go. So please check that out. I cannot wait to read this book because it just sounds phenomenal. So thank you so much for coming on the show today. Thank you for sharing your expertise, for being vulnerable. I know this is tough to talk about, but you're doing the hard work. You're really doing some of the hardest work, I believe, on the planet. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Alyssa, too. And really, we're all going to have to do the hard work.
So true. So true. Thanks for listening, everyone. For more information, please head over to lightaftertrauma.com, or you can also follow us on social media. On Instagram, we are at lightaftertrauma, and on Twitter, it is at lightafterpod. Lastly, please head over to patreon.com/lightaftertrauma to support our show. We are asking for $5 a month, which is the equivalent to a cup of coffee at Starbucks. So please head on over again. That's patreon.com/lightaftertrauma. Thank you, and we appreciate your support.